I'm going to talk about something, I'm going to talk about vulnerability today, but I'm going to talk about an aspect of it that I have not spent a lot of time talking about, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about and researching. And I want to start with two questions that I really want you to think about. And the two questions are, what should I be afraid of today? And who's to blame? What should scare me, and whose fault is it? To me, these are the most profoundly dangerous questions that we center our lives around. And what they are indicators, to me, what they're indicators of is a culture of scarcity, a culture of not enough. And when you think about any milieu in your life, think about education. What are we supposed to be afraid of, and who's to blame? Politics, the economy, social issues. I guarantee you, if you turn on the news or opened a paper today, the focus would be, here's why you should be afraid, and here's whose fault it is. And what's interesting to me about that is it's not just at a cultural level or a community level. That stuff happens in my house every week. Every week with my husband, I talk to him about what should be, why we should be fearful and whose fault it is. Mostly it's his. But if something doesn't go well at my daughter's school, then I'm like, oh my God, this is going to have huge implications for our university. And we should be terrified right now that she's not getting cursive. I know she's 4, but this is still relevant. And so when those questions become the center of conversation in our communities, in our homes, in our schools, in our offices, how many of you have ever worked in an office where the central question is, what should I be afraid of today, and whose fault is it? I mean, if you've ever worked, you should have your hand up. It's indicative of scarcity. So let's talk about what scarcity culture is and what it looks like. Scarcity culture, I think, is best understood with a simple question of never enough. And you can fill in the blanks. Never good enough, safe enough, certain enough, perfect enough, relevant enough. And perhaps I think one of the most dangerous and insidious messages today is never extraordinary enough. Somehow, in the world we live in today, an ordinary life has become synonymous with a meaningless life. And it has huge, and I've watched it happen not only as a researcher, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I sit across from people and look in their eyes, and I have a good sense of what's going on in their lives. But as a university professor who's been teaching for the last 17 years, it's been very clear to me that extraordinary means relevant. A couple of years ago, this is a terrible example, but the truth, a couple of years ago, it was huge controversy in the US because Rutgers University paid the highest honorarium it had ever paid in the history of the university to Snooki, the reality TV star of the Jersey Shore. This filters into our DNA and becomes messaging for us. And so scarcity is about never, and the top one is the big one for all of us personally, never good enough. Which is shame, which we all have on occasion, that sense that we're not smart enough, good enough, perfect enough, loved enough, promoted enough. We're not enough. So what we do in response to scarcity culture, I think all of us every day, is this. We wake up in the morning and we armor up. And we put it on and we say, I'm going to go out in the world. I'm basically just going to kick some ass. I'm not going to let anyone see who I am. And in doing so, I can protect myself against the things that hurt the most. Judgment, criticism, fear, blame, ridicule. I'm going to armor up and I'm going to be safe. And we rationalize and we convince ourselves that this armor is really smart. And we use a lot of different things to armor too. Perfectionism, intellectualizing. Truly, I have to be honest with you, before the TED Talk, which accidentally went viral, and was a total experiment. I thought, let me be vulnerable while I'm talking about vulnerability. It's a small group. How bad could it be if a few hundred people think I'm nuts? But before that talk, do you know what the name of my lecture that I gave all the time, all over? The name, Variables Mitigating Self-Conscious Affect. It never went viral. But that was my university-issued armor. You know, if all else fails, use words that are really big, that you're quasi-sure what they mean. You know, so we use a lot of different things to armor, right? But if you get really, really clear about what we're doing every morning when we wake up and decide to armor, it's this simple. This is what we're protecting. We're protecting being hurt for a very simple reason that no one really wants to talk about, which is this: love, belonging, irreducible needs of men, women, and children. In the absence of love and belonging, there is always suffering. And so what we believe is that we can protect our sense of being lovable and being acceptable and being worth connection with armor. Here's the very worst news from my research. The news that above all other I did not want to hear is simply this. And I don't even want to say it to you because I think it's mean to say it. But it's so true. And it's simply our capacity for wholeheartedness can never be greater than our willingness to be brokenhearted, which is a terrible thing, but a truthful thing. That we can only love and be loved as much as we are willing to have our heart broken. And so when we move through the world like this, and with our partners, with our children, with our friends, in classrooms, with the people who work for us, with the people we work for, there are tremendous casualties. You know, I shared this. This is one of the most interesting things. I did a lecture in Miami, Florida about a year ago, and it was being translated through American Sign Language. So there were two people signing as I spoke. And they came up to me before the talk, and they said, are there any words that you're going to use a lot that we may need to know about, because anything that's weird or clinical? And I said, well, vulnerability is a word I'm going to use a lot. And they kind of looked at each other and I said, well, we have a sign for vulnerability. It's this. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, it means weak in the knees. And I was like, oh God, that's not the sign. And they kind of talked for a second. They said, well, there's only one other sign for vulnerability, and it's kind of weird. And I said, well, what is it? And she said, it's this. I said, that would be the one I'm talking about. And so rather than walking through the world like this, most of us do this. And in fact, I think the troublesome thing about doing this is that it doesn't really safeguard us from pain, but it does prevent us from accessing the things that vulnerability takes us to. Vulnerability is the path to love, belonging, joy, intimacy, trust, innovation, and creativity. You know, think about this for a second. 85% of the men and women we've interviewed, 13,000 pieces of data, 85% can recall a time in school that was so shaming, it forever changed how they thought of themselves as learners. 50% of those stories involved art and creativity. Now today I get asked to go into corporations, organizations, and the number one problem is there's no innovation. We don't understand what's happening. Without vulnerability, there can be no creativity. There can be no innovation. Without failure, which is maybe the ultimate experience of vulnerability, which can't happen when you're locked down like this, there can never be innovation. But I would argue one of the greatest casualties of invulnerability is this: empathy. Let me ask a question, a little audience participation. You share something very vulnerable with someone, and when you look at them, what you know is they deeply understand what you're talking about, and they get it, and they're really right there with you in it. How does that feel? Amazing. Thumbs up. Awesome. Supportive. What else? Say again? Intimate. Loving. Connected. Say again? Reassuring. Safe. Relief. You share something incredibly vulnerable with someone, and they don't get it at all, and they're just standing across from you. How does that feel? Shame. We've got the choir right here. Shame. Okay. Shame. What else? I'm sorry? Lost. Annoying. Rejected. Terror. Isolating. Okay, so from shame, terror, isolating, disconnection. These are not good experiences. And interestingly, guess what those experiences drive? Scarcity. And so scarcity seduces us into locking up our hearts and then keeps them locked by making sure that there's very little empathy in the world. So let's talk about some of the big blocks to empathy that are born out of a lack of vulnerability. I loved this photo because it's armor, but it's a close-up of armor. Sympathy. So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? How many of you think about empathy and sympathy as very different things? A few people. Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. I'll tell you why. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar, actually from the UK, who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. 4 things that empathy always had in common. They were perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth, staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do, recognizing emotion in other people, and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. So if Tim called, Tim, I'm going to use you as an example. Is that okay? Go ahead. Tim called and said, I just finished my rewrites on this article. I'm trying to think of something we have in common, which is writing. I just finished my rewrites on this article, and they've sent it back again, and I just have this overwhelming feeling that nothing's going to please these folks. So to respond empathically, or empathetically, you can say it either way, I would need to try to understand his perspective, stay out of judgment, recognize what he's feeling, and kind of communicate it back. Now, when you're teaching graduate students who are new to counseling, they like to go, oh, Tim, you must be feeling so sad. I feel that with you. Which is not exactly what empathy looks like. Painfully sometimes, maybe. But if he said that to me and I went, oh, shit, I hate that. Would you know? I've been there. I hate that. Or if I looked at him and said, or talked on the phone even and said, oh God, there's nothing worse than just keep on sending it in and sending it in. That's empathy. Empathy is, I'm feeling with you. Sympathy, I'm feeling for you. How would it feel, Tim, if I said, oh, you poor thing? How does that feel for y'all? Okay, so someone just went like this. Like, keep it. So sympathy is about feeling for, empathy is feeling with. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is dark, deep hole. Ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is, I see ya, it's bad, but stuff like that didn't happen to people like me. In Texas, who said yay? Are there Texans here? Houstonian? Y'all were my favorite right from the beginning. I knew there was something, empathically. In Texas, in the South in general, in the US, we have the worst saying ever that just smacks and reeks of sympathy, which is if Tim called and said, I keep sending it in and they keep pushing it back. And I looked at you and said, bless your heart. How does that feel? It makes you pretty mad. Because basically what I'm saying is that sucks, but too bad, and God is on my side. I've decided I can make $1 million in Texas by simply selling a t-shirt that says, if you bless my heart, I'll punch your face. So empathy is, you can't, with a locked up heart, with invulnerability, you cannot be empathic, because when you call me, empathy is not the default. Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. And when you called, man, I was just unloading the dishwasher, minding my own business in my happy place. And now I have to connect with the fact that, truthfully, I could wallpaper this room with rejection and revision letters. And I have to touch base with that place in order to be empathic back. So sympathy is one of the things that really gets in the way of empathy. And sympathy is also often how we respond when we don't want to be vulnerable to someone else's struggle. Does that make sense? The next one, I'm going to get hot talking about it. I just know I'm going to go into a little shame, but then I'll pop right out. Nothing will, if you're on the first row, you're safe. Blame. How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? I'm like, hi, my name is Brené. I am a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house, I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm getting ready to go teach, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: damn you, Steve. Who is my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends, and the night before he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back like at 10:30, chatting it up with his friends. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed at 10. Therefore, okay, and let me just ask, because I'm going to assume that you're laughing with me, not at me. How many women in here are thinking, that makes absolute sense? And how many men in here are thinking, oh, that's how it works? Right. And so the rest of that story is, I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all, like dial tone. Because he knows. You're not allowed to laugh. You're here in an official capacity. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? Even me, like when I'm, even I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. It gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the na thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability, meaning that people who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this. No, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger, which is really hard. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was. The last one is interesting. Let me ask y'all some questions. When you are sharing something, I want to do a show of hands, and I kind of want you to look around at the answers. When you're sharing something very vulnerable and raw with someone, how many of you like the person you're talking to look you right in the eye? Raise your hand. How many of you like the person to kind of look away or look down? How many of you, when you're sharing something really vulnerable, would like the person you're talking to reach out and embrace you? How many people would like that person to stay physically away from you while you're talking? You're the people I would hang out with. Okay. How many of you, when you share something vulnerable, would like for the person across from you to say something back right away? How many of you would you prefer that person to stay quiet? Okay, so do you see what happened in here just now? Empathy is not scripted. I can't say, okay, go forth and be empathic. Here's the decision tree. You know, if they say this, do this. Empathy is about being present with someone. And if you're present and engaged and you take the armor off, you'll know what the person across from you needs. But more importantly, if you screw it up and you see in the eyes of the person that you're, who's sharing with you that you've screwed it up, you can go back and say, no, Tim, okay, wait, I'm just a hugger. I'm here, I'm with you. Keep telling me, I want to know. I want to be in this with you. The reason why I think that exercise is so helpful is, again, we all need different things from empathy. There are no hard and fast rules about what empathy looks like or sounds like, but there is one that I will share with you from the research. It is, rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. How does that feel? Who said awful? Awful. Awful. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better instead of leaning into, if I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. And so I want to close with this picture, because how many of you when someone shares something with you, do you worry about saying the right thing or being helpful? For sure, I think most of us. So I love this photo, and the reason I'm sharing it with you is because sometimes the most profound and eloquent examples of empathy happen without any words, and sometimes not even with eye contact. To me, if I'm sitting next to you and I say, wow, I feel like everything's just, the wheels are falling off right now and things are out of control, and someone just puts their hand on top of my hand and squeezes, that says, with touch, I think, the two most important words in my work, which are me too. So thank y'all very much. I really appreciate it.